reserves were originally created in the 1920s for the purpose of watershed protection. So it goes back that far. And those were the original designations that were created. At that time, there were a lot of impacts from feral ungulates that were degrading the watersheds and devegetating a lot of areas. So the forest reserves were set up originally for that purpose. And so there's a lot of acreage in those. And then as the years went on, a natural area reserve system was created later. And the natural area reserve system was created for a slightly different purpose, which was preservation of biodiversity, indigenous biodiversity, protection of native ecosystems and natural areas. So watershed protection is connected to that, but it wasn't the same purpose. But in practice, we do watershed protection as part of everything else that we do on all the lands that we manage. And it's one of the many objectives we have. We do watershed protection, we have a public hunting program, we do protection for endangered species and indigenous species, trails and recreation program. And so we integrate all these things together. And it's one of many objectives that we have. And so we're working on now, we have management guidelines for our lands that lay out what our primary management goals are for different areas in the watershed protection.
We've had a lot of ungulate issues, goats, deer, been also impacted by pigs, and we've had some issues of cattle. And so over the years, this is generational. Over the years, it's just been impacted, vegetation, no natural recruitment. So it's almost like that park-like setting, where you have the mature trees that the ungulates couldn't get to, and then now you have no natural recruitment, so now it's just a park-like grazed, mowed lawn and mature trees. And our job is to try and reestablish that forest again and try and get some of that natural recruitment back and through some outplanting projects and whatnot.
What we call feral ungulates, these are hooved mammals. They're all introduced to Hawaii, they're not native. And so the indigenous plants, in particular in the Hawaiian Islands, are vulnerable to being eaten. They don't have these natural defenses against these mammals because they didn't evolve through all the years in coevolution with these animals. So when you have these animals loose on the landscape, they're browsing and grazing, and they can kill endangered plants, and they will very quickly denude an area of vegetation. And when that happens, then you increase soil runoff and sedimentation, and that in turn has impacts on the streams. It ends up in the water and impacts the intertidal zone and the coral reefs as well. So it has far-reaching effects. So what we need to do when we have an area that's prioritized for watershed protection is we need to put up a fence that will prevent these animals from coming in. And that's typically the first tool that we use, is to put up a fence and then get the animals out and keep them out.
And it's in the hopes of to reestablish that native forest again, that the coral here forest, that's where a lot of the fog builds up, a lot of the clouds will roll in, and I think it's on its way. Just from the fencing alone, we've noticed some of our guys have been camping. Just on the fencing alone, they've already noticed about some natural recruitment with some young koa seedlings coming out, and that's a good sign. I mean, it's proving that the fence is actually doing its job, the intentions of the fence. So it's given us some hope. And natural area reserve side, they've been doing some outplanting since early last year, and it's been looking pretty nice. So that's a collaborative effort between the natural area reserve and the forestry program. We're trying to make it, it's beyond our natural resources. It doesn't know any boundaries. It's kind of, so we're just trying to manage it as one big whole parcel. And so far it's working out great.
It's not just feral ungulates. There are a lot of other threats, and in particular invasive plants. There are several species of invasive plants that are just so invasive they will just take over an area. For example, strawberry guava. This is a species that will invade an area and it'll displace the native forest to the point where there's really just nothing left. It'll outshade everything. It becomes just a monocrop across the area. So control of invasive plants, control of invasive pathogens and forest diseases, those are all important as well.
So sometimes some people have the mistaken notion that fencing is there to keep people out. That's not the case.
No, absolutely not. Unless there are a few areas where we will use a fence for that purpose, but almost all of our areas are public areas that are open for the public. We want the public to go into these areas. These are public lands, and they're set aside in these reserves for the benefit of the people. And that's our goal, is for people to be able to use them. So what we do when we put up fences, we go and talk to the people who use the area, and we figure out where people like to enter and what we find where the trails are, and then we put in gates or step overs in those areas to make sure that people can go. It's important to us that people do go into these areas. We don't want to keep the public out. We want the people to be able to go and enjoy these resources so that they understand their value and that they understand why we're doing what we're doing. Successes go all the way back to the 1920s. When the original foresters created the forest reserve system, there was a lot of damage at that time, and a lot of runoff and impacts to the streams and the reefs, and a lot of loss of soil. So it goes back that far. What the foresters and the forestry department did back then was reforest a lot of areas, and they did a lot of ungulate and invasive species control back then too. So it's not new. This has been ongoing for 100 years. We've had increasing success recently because there's been more attention focused on the need for watershed protection, and we've been getting more and more support from public and constituents, communities, and the legislature in terms of supporting the funding that we need. So in the last 10 to 20 years, there's been a lot more progress as well. And the progress in the more recent years is tended to be more focused on reforesting areas with indigenous species. And that's important because indigenous species are especially adapted to the Hawaiian Islands and their environments, and so they tend to do better. They're better at retaining water. They function better as watersheds.